This week's episode of the Cloudcast is brought to you by Intel Cloud for All, driving the creation of thousands of clouds.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast, coming to you live from our massive studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Just me tonight. And tonight we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to put on a little Beethoven. We're going to put on our smoking jacket. We're going to do a book review tonight. No, actually, I'm just sort of messing around with you. We are going to talk about a book though tonight. We have a really kind of exciting guest. Sometimes, and I recommend this to people all the time. If you've got a really cool topic that you want to come talk to us about or share with people, just tell us. And tonight's guest, Dave Zwieback, who is not only the author of a brand new book, which we're going to talk a bunch about, called Beyond Blame, but also head of engineering at NextBigSound, which is part of Pandora. So Dave, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here, Brian.
Like I told folks, you kind of reached out to us and you said, hey guys, wrote this book, and we've had a number of people who've reached out to us about different things, and sometimes they're kind of just pimping stuff because they're something new. The timing of this is really good. Now, you and I were talking about this before the show. So anybody who's been listening recently, when we were talking with Mark Imbriaco, we got to talking about kind of the human side, the collaboration side of operations, and the challenges that are going on with that, and people are trying to keep systems up and running, and talked a little bit about burnout and people not trying to figure out how to deal with these systems that are running 24/7. We talked with Bridget Kromhout last week about what it's like to be in operations and being with pagers and all this stuff. And so this is sort of the next perfect chapter. So the timing of this was really good. Give us a little bit about your background, because one of the things that we always like to have when people talk about big topics is, you're sort of living it. Talk about what you do in your day-to-day job and your background and what you're doing over at Big Sound or NextBigSound first.
So I've been in and around large-scale complex systems for about 20 years now, and certainly have witnessed and have been part of many an outage, but also built some systems that are still probably running all these years later. Yeah, so I've been at NextBigSound for about 2.5 years, a little bit less than that. And as you mentioned, we've been recently acquired by Pandora, another reasonably large.
A name people have heard?
Well, at least in the U.S. We currently only stream in the U.S. and Australia and New Zealand. But we're pretty big, let's put it that way. So I spent about the first 15 years of my career pretty much in large enterprises, many of them in finance or pharmaceuticals. And whenever things went wrong, I've certainly witnessed a lot of kind of default behavior, finding somebody to blame or to punish and so on. And, it always felt a little weird, not just from a kind of human perspective, but from I don't know if letting this person go or limiting this person's access to the system is actually going to help us in the future. It's like you get that discomfort of, I'm not sure if this actually is helping.
Right.
And so after a little while, I sort of started to be part more of this sort of velocity, DevOps, whatever you call that kind of echo chamber, and met John Allspaw and some of the folks that you also mentioned, Mark Imbriaco, who's a big inspiration as well. And, they were talking about a completely different approach to handling, complex systems and how they failed and also how they functioned. And so I got really inspired, and a lot of what they've brought to our field has to do with sort of the human factors of things, or the resilience engineering, or even sort of the cognitive psychology. And so it's certainly outside of, my own comfort zone, and many of us are kind of, it's a little bit outside of everybody's comfort zone, right?
Right.
For most of the techies with traditional backgrounds.
Yeah, and it sort of dawns on me. I know Mark and I were talking about it, and I said, look, we're kind of moving from this world where if you were in big enterprise IT, in essence, you could kind of buy your way to a comfort level. And I don't want to say you could buy your way to stability, but the types of applications tended to be, relatively stable. They weren't kind of living in constant chaos, and you could buy enough hardware or enough bandwidth or something to sort of go, hey, I feel pretty comfortable that, on most Saturday nights and Friday nights, I'm not going to get paged. And that's kind of changing. I mean, the economics are changing, the end user experience of, not only 24/7, but just like instant responsiveness and cool UIs and, really intelligent, recommendations and stuff is really changing that. And when I think about the folks that are tasked with operating these things, the level of once the level of expectations goes up, the level of stress goes up, the level of, the people that run the business, their stress levels go up. What drove you to go, hey, I want to write about this, as opposed to just, maybe getting better at it as a craft professionally?
So once I've sort of had this, epiphany or sort of paradigm shift, where it's like, oh, there is a completely different way to treat outages and the people involved in them, right? And that particular way actually results in more resilient systems over time. Then, a lot of my former coworkers and all the folks that I've worked with over the last 2 decades, many of them, that approach is super counterintuitive.
Right.
We jump to this conclusion, the blame, right, so easily. Like, let's say you're driving behind some guy or girl in the car and she slams the brakes. What are you doing? Right?
Right.
Like, immediately.
Must be her fault.
Right.
Or his fault or whoever's, right?
Exactly, right? And it feels really good because we have that like kind of immediate and comfortable story about what happened. And then we can go on our merry way. But if we really like stop to think, like, that's not even like the tip of the iceberg, right? And so what we left on the table when we jumped to that quick blame conclusion is a lot of learning.
Right.
Things that can actually, in that example, can actually make driving for ourselves and others safer, for instance, right? And so what really kind of, this is a bit of a passion project for me.
Okay.
Because I really would love to see this way of thinking take root, especially in some of the industries that I worked with, like finance, where it's certainly a lot of blame, and also the opposite of blame, a lot of sort of hero worship.
Right.
That goes on. And neither of those things, there's a little bit here, like I have money in the financial system, as I'm sure you do, right?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And it's like I have kind of a vested interest that system continue to work reasonably well.
Right.
So even on that level, I feel like it's an important thing to talk about and to try to get out there. Right.
So when you had reached out to us, you said, hey, here's a copy of the book, and I had a chance to go ahead and read it, and I wasn't totally sure what I was going to get myself into, only because, and I hope this doesn't come across the wrong way to the DevOps community, but a lot of times, they want to cite, these very sort of esoteric theories, and have you read so-and-so's writing? Have you read so-and-so's writing? And you kind of feel like there's a part of you going, okay, this is going to be a big academic exercise, and it really it really sort of relates to like manufacturing, but I have to sort of, tie it to data centers or moving bits or whatever it is. And the thing I loved about your book, and I'm not going to give away the theme of it, but for anybody, and I'll say this just purely from, being completely transparent. I read the thing in 2 hours. It's about 80 pages. It took me about 2 hours. It's really a good read. And the whole concept of it is it centers around this idea of blameless post-mortems, which is, or I'll say that's sort of at least the most common term, I think. But it's written very much in the same tone that Gene Kim had written the Phoenix Project. So for anybody who's read the Phoenix Project, and I hope that's a fair analogy or sort of comparison. I mean, it's written in sort of a storytelling mode, so that you can relate to it. There are characters, you can sympathize with the characters, you can relate to the characters. Why did you take that approach? Because a lot of times it's you have to have read Deming and you have to have read so and so and so and so. Like, why did you take the storytelling approach as opposed to something else?
I actually wanted to write a book that I could read.
Yeah.
And I had to actually read a lot of the folks that you mentioned. I did read Daniel Kahneman's 500-page Thinking Fast and Slow. I did read a bunch of Sidney Decker's work, David Wood's work. These are the folks from sort of safety or resilience engineering. Eric Halnagel, Gary Klein, all these folks.
Right. And they're fantastic things. Don't get me wrong. They're tremendous thinking put in there.
Absolutely. And I cite them. And of course, I'm basically standing on the shoulders of giants, right?
Sure.
The term of blameless postmortem, comes from John Allspa, currently, CTO of Etsy. And so, like, all the credit goes to these folks. They're deep thinkers, and what I wanted to do is to sort of make it a vivid story that you can relate to. And I think we all, like, if we've been around, big complex systems for a while, we'll relate to what happens in the book, which, is an incident that almost essentially takes a big financial institution out of business. And we'll relate to the characters, and we'll recognize parts of ourselves in these characters.
Yep.
And the journeys that they have to go through to sort of get to that understanding of, like, oh, this old way of thinking about it, maybe it's not that useful. Right. It's not really bad. It's just not that helpful. And so that's the reason that I wrote a short, kind of pithy. It's a work of fiction, but the number one feedback that I've gotten, especially from folks who had sort of worked in finance, is like, oh my God, this describes my world.
Right.
Certainly I've changed names to protect the innocent. But, a lot of these are composite sort of characters and folks that I've actually worked very closely with and that I have a lot of, empathy for. And so, and this was also sort of the audience who I was writing for.
I can speak for myself. I wasn't working for any of the financial institutions, but I was working support for some vendors that used to provide equipment to them, and I've been on that side of it where we were either trying to fix it or we were probably the root cause of some of those problems. So yeah, it's a very relatable story for anybody who's been hands-on in the industry. So I want to talk a little bit. I mean, at the core of it, you talk about kind of how, why people have to change some ways of thinking, and I won't give away the kind of the premise of the book, but give us some background as to, why this is a reality. Why do people have to start thinking about some of these, learning processes and so forth differently? What's changed in the underlying systems?
Well, it's the complexity of the system. Or the systems that we work with. And by the way, when I say systems, I also mean the humans that are working within these systems that are trying to operate these systems. Right. It's basically we're at the stage where certainly no single human can really reason or understand about some of these systems. Let's put it that way. They're just too big and too dependent. I mean, just to give you an example, right? If you run anything in AWS, you could sort of reason about some of these things. But of course, there's a level of abstraction beyond which you're probably not going to be able to reason or understand too much. So read any AWS Post-Mortem just to understand, oh my God, the complexity of that system is incredible. And even the folks that are dealing with it day in, day out that have built it cannot predict how it's going to function or how it's going to break down. Right. And so because of that, because of all that sort of emergent behavior that is inherent with complex systems, we have to approach them differently. And so we basically have to take anything that happens in them as a learning opportunity, right? Yep. And so not only the things that go wrong, but also the things that go right. The more we can learn about the system, as a result, the more understanding we can build, the more resilient that system becomes. Right.
One of the things when, and I don't know if you realize this, but anytime you sort of start talking about a topic, and the topic is, hey, we've got to make some changes in order to get better, there's an inherent thing that sort of goes, okay, is this a binary thing where we either have to do that or it won't work, which I don't think is the case here. No. And then the second thing becomes, well, given where any company is today, so we're company X, and we sort of are here in terms of how we deal with when there's failures and trying to learn from them. How do we get better? Do you, this isn't one of the things that's called out in the book, because again, the book is really around this story. I mean, have you found, is there sort of a journey to better postmortems, or a journey to how to do more enlightened learning? Is there steps that people can kind of follow, or frameworks they can follow?
What a great question. Thank you for asking it. I would love to be able to write and sell, like a best practice, like do this.
Yeah.
One of these sort of clickbait titles, like 5 steps to a better, learning reviews or better postmortems or whatever it is.
Right, yeah.
The thing is, because we're dealing with complex systems, right? And because, as you very correctly pointed out, it has a lot to do with culture, corporate culture, company culture. Yeah, it is not something that there's no best practice. It's something that you will have to figure out, that sort of makes sense in your own organization. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the first point. The second point is it's a gamut. It's a spectrum, right? You never get to 100% blame-free, bias-free, simply because you've got human beings involved, right? And it's just pretty much impossible for us to get there. What you can do is, over time, slowly move the needle towards a more helpful kind of postmortems, more helpful learning reviews. Yep. And by the way, I use these terms interchangeably. I think that postmortems have a lot of history and a lot of kind of, even the name postmortem, like after death, somebody died, sounds kind of morbid.
Sinister, yeah.
There's a lot of history about what it means, and usually you do it only when something fails and all this kind of stuff. So I certainly personally prefer the term learning review, because it kind of, even in the phrase, it allows to kind of set the context. Hey, this thing is about learning. We're going to get together and we're going to do some stuff. We're going to talk about some stuff that hopefully helps us learn, not figure out, the root cause or who killed, John Kennedy or whatever it is. So it's a gamut, right? And it's about moving your organization forward. What I offer in the book, and what we also offer in the Postmortems workshop that my partner and I conduct, is a framework and approach to conducting. It's an approach to conducting these learning reviews effectively. Mm-hmm. And in our experience, the biggest kind of part of that I think anybody can adopt reasonably easily, it's about setting the context and reminding the participants of that learning review what this thing is about. So, it talks about, it reminds folks, hey, we're dealing with a complex system. It has emergent behavior. We could not have predicted how this thing that we're about to try to review would have gone, right? No way, right? It's emergent behavior. Secondly, we're going to be under the influence of biases.
Sure.
So cognitive biases, outcome bias, hindsight bias, fundamental attribution error. I cover some of these things in the book.
Right.
But if you want the canonical text on that, certainly Daniel Kahneman's work. He got the Nobel Prize in behavioral economics for doing that work. So definitely refer to his work. Gary Klein as well, by the way. So how can we, as a team, be mindful of these biases? And what can we do as a group to sort of counteract them? Right. Individually, it's very hard. Like, Daniel Kahneman says that he's no better now, 40 years after starting to study cognitive biases, at spotting them in himself than he was 40 years ago. But as a group, if we're sort of a little bit versed in what those things look like, how they manifest, then we have a chance of, on a group level, being able to counteract them. Right. To a certain extent.
So I'm gonna sort of ask one last question here, and we can go on about this. I'm gonna give away just a tidbit of the book. The book throughout, there's this concept of accountability. Some of the people that are in charge or management or represented as management talk about accountability, and there's an area where one of the characters sort of gives this alternative definition of accountability, and it's presented in a way that, kind of in a way when people go, well, the origin of a word really means this, and I guess what I'm wondering is, and maybe you cover this in some of your some of the things when you do your teaching. To me, it sort of jumped out at me as, most people tend to think about accountability as there's a blame aspect to it, and this really was what we want is all of the information without any blame, and that was part of the definitional thing. I can see where this takes root in certain cultures because especially the technologists who are tasked with this. What do you find? Because accountability, if you go to business school or you sort of are in these management circles where there's MBOs and KPIs and all these other sort of measured things that. How do you get through that part of it? I mean, I know that's part of all the other culture, but accountability is one of those words that I think people sometimes sort of think they know what it means, and you do a really interesting job of expanding upon that.
The definition of accountability actually comes from the U.S. military, of all places. And basically what it means in that context is being compelled to provide an account of what happened. Now, since this whole learning review thing and blameless post-mortems, its sole goal is to let that sort of unleash that learning, to let that information flow. And when we have real accountability, meaning that people actually provide, full accounts of what had happened, that's when we can maximize our learning. Yeah, so when there is full accountability, meaning people are able to provide a full account of what happened, that's when that learning is maximized. Now, the moment you have any blame, it's a very natural human reaction to that, or fear of punishment, to basically cover your ass. Right? To limit the amount of information that you disclose, to, edit it, to withhold, to try to escape being involved in these reviews and so on.
Right.
And so it's a very natural thing. And so folks like Sidney Dekker, they basically say that, you get to pick one. You either get to pick accountability or you get to pick blame, And so that's essentially the redefinition of accountability is kind of necessary. And it's a very uncomfortable transition, I have to say. Even because of very natural accountability, that transition from an accountability, which basically means whose throat am I going to choke, whom am I going to blame, whom am I going to punish, who is the root cause of a particular incident, to an accountability of I would like to collect and gather as much information from as many diverse perspectives as possible so that we can learn, so that we can maximize learning, so that we can make our systems better over time. It's a very uncomfortable transition, because even for myself, the first place I go when I hear about something is, well, who is responsible, right? Who did this? Who moved the cheese? And luckily I've been doing this work for a little while to where the second thing that comes is well, that's a nice story. What is it? Cool story, bro. But that story that I just constructed about, what happened is just not that helpful. It basically stops the learning on a very surface level.
Right. Yeah, no, it's definitely a, this is, like you said, this is getting into some psychological things that are pretty deeply ingrained in people. And, as we're dealing with more complicated systems, more interconnected systems, you have to realize that there's, sort of second order effects that are happening that people, if they want to be successful and want to stay with it for a long time, are going to have to start to get very versed with, as well as they get versed with the technology, because there's a people aspect of this and there's an expectation aspect of this. Listen, I'm gonna wrap it up with that. This has been, like I said, I really like the book. I really enjoyed it. I recommend it to people. We'll have a link to the show notes. What's the best way for people if they want to follow? They go read the book. They're in the middle of it. They want to follow up with you, or they just kind of want to figure out what else you're interested in doing. What's a good way to kind of follow you or find what you're working on?
Well, first of all, thanks for the kind words.
You're welcome.
And you could find me on Twitter at Mindweather, and mindweather.com, which we're in the process of sort of revamping so that folks have a little bit more information about the workshops that we do and sort of other coaching type services that we provide to folks that are interested in this journey.
Cool. Very cool. Yeah, simple thoughts on complex systems. So, listen, Dave, thank you so much for being on tonight. Really enjoyed it, folks. Like I said, if you're interested in the book, it's called Beyond Blame. We'll have a link to it in the show notes. So, thank you very much for being on tonight. For Aaron, who should be on here pretty soon. Thanks for everybody, and have a great week. And thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.